The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am delighted to invite to the show today, Andrea Zuvich. Andrea, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, the topic we are going to discuss today is not quite Tudors, but as many of my listeners know, I do enjoy all royal history. And so to talk about the I can't even talk today, to talk about the Stuart period really isn't that far from the Tudors. I kind of tried to associate it with maybe Mary, Queen of Scots, because really they all descended from her, didn't they?
They sure did, yes.
And
There's a lot of blending of histories here and a continuation from the Tudor
yes,
to the Stuarts. So there's a lot of shared history there.
there definitely is. And today I invited you here to talk about the topic of your new book, Ravenous, that came out. And this book is about Barbara Villiers, or maybe it's pronounced a different way. Why don't we start with that? Because that was one of the first things that you mentioned in your book that intrigued me. How do you pronounce this last name?
Well, there is a great deal of controversy about this. There are some who would pronounce it Villiers, of course. That's how it's spelled. But many people that I came in contact with who are aristocratic and from those other circles would say it as Villiers. So Barbara Villiers.
Oh.
So, you know, take your pick, really.
Which one do you prefer?
Well, I've been doing Villiers, but I am originally American, so it's a bit different, I suppose. So it ends up being more, I suppose, anglicized, perhaps, when I say it like that.
Okay, so you won't be
Yeah.
offended if I say Villiers.
Nope, go ahead.
It's just ingrained in my brain, right? After all of these years and centuries, just to say Villiers to me, just it comes
Yeah,
more naturally.
I don't think it matters, so that's fine.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
why don't we start? Obviously, most people will probably recognize her name as a mistress of King Charles II. But before that, I kind of want to go into her lineage a little bit more to understand where she came from and who she was. Can we start maybe with her parentage and kind of go from there?
Sure, but perhaps we'll go even further back. She came from the Villiers or Villiers family, and they were one of the most influential and powerful families in the 17th century. And this really began during the reign of King James VI, or First of England. He was known to have favorites, and they were male favorites usually. And the most important one of these favorites was George Villiers. And he became the first Duke of Buckingham. And he's very, very famous even today. I mean, anyone who has enjoyed The Three Musketeers, for example, knows he's a very big character in that. But the historical figure upon whom this Dumas character was based was extremely handsome, very much beloved of the king. And he sort of put the Villiers family on the map. So he was very powerful with James I and also later with James's son and heir, Charles I. The relationship between George and James was very different to the relationship between George and Charles. Charles saw him more as an older brother, because of course Charles's elder brother Henry died in 1612. So that relationship was different from the one between George and James, which was more romantic, perhaps even sexual. So it was a very different relationship. Moving that aside, the family that George was born into was already sort of mixed in a way. He had an elder brother. Now, that's what's important here. Um, William there's William Villiers, who was the father of Barbara, and his grandfather had been the elder half brother of this famous or infamous George. Um, so Barbara came into this world in 1640 to this highly influential family, the Villiers family. Um, and she was born in November of 1640 to William and his wife, Mary Baining. And both couples came from prestigious backgrounds. Mary's family owned land, and William's, as I said, grandfather was connected, was the elder half brother of the Duke of Buckingham. But by 1640, the three kingdoms were already headed for trouble. So there was a great deal of political turmoil, religious tensions. So perhaps I can liken it to things that were seen during the Tudor period. This was getting even perhaps more dangerous, and it ultimately turned into civil war, which was completely devastating. Um, so we have political and religious tensions, and they were simmering around her birth, 1640. By August of 1642, war was formally declared. Now, Barbara's family was royalist, so they fought for King Charles I. Um, and so she was about two and a half, and her father went off to fight. And so she she had this sort of unstable childhood already because her father was off fighting in the wars. Um, and by 1643, during the siege of Bristol, her father, William, was he was shot in his right leg, and a few weeks later he died, and he was only 29. So Barbara really didn't have any memories of her father, but she did know that he was considered a great hero, a loyal, gallant man. So he was considered very respectable, um, and and gallant, really. That's a word that was used for him by some of his contemporaries. And so that was a very huge blow to her mother, of course, who became a widow, and to her, just a little girl without a
Yeah.
father.
I can't imagine. You can relate to what it would feel like today to have something like that happen.
Mm,
But it was probably even more devastating to a widow and a young child back then
mhm.
because they didn't have necessarily all of the resources that we have to us today. So
Yeah.
your heart can't help but go out to someone who would lose a parent at such a young age. Um,
Yes.
One of the things that I loved about how you were telling a story about how she was as a child and how she was such a strong-willed child,
Mm.
I felt like maybe I could identify with that a little bit. And then one of the other things that you discussed, which I think kind of surprised me that, and I did not know about the I keep calling them the Studers. I'm just going to combine together the Stuarts and the Tudors today.
Hey, why not? Right.
During the Tudor period, it does seem like the nobility was very keen to educate their daughters. But that was a little bit different during the 17th century, wasn't it?
Yes, things had changed. We often think about Lady Jane and Elizabeth I, who had amazing educations. Uh, what Sir Thomas More's children as well. We can name so many. However, by the 100 years later, this was very different. It was more about being pious and dutiful and submissive and um, charitable. So things were very different. Uh, Girls weren't taught as much generally. I mean, of course, there were some who would have done this, who would have educated their daughters well. But Barbara was pretty typical of her time, really. She didn't have a great deal of education, and so she didn't have many skills or or much, as I said, much education. What she did have, however, was her beauty, and she used that. Oh boy, did she use that to her advantage. Hmm.
Yes, she definitely did. I don't remember if you talked about this in her book, but what were the things that maybe she was taught? Like, was she into horseback riding? Did she do needlework? Any of those things?
She's not really known for her needlework. That's something that people like Mary the Second was known for. But she had her interests. She loved dancing. And I think that's because she was very confident. She was very comfortable with her body. Of course, she she was very good at dancing, and um, she was no wallflower. She would love to be the center of attention. She loved fashion. She was a fashion trend center at the time. Um, and she had an aviary, so she liked birds
Hmm.
more than likely. And we have some evidence that she ordered bookcases, and whether she was into reading, we're not really sure. It could have just been a status symbol to show, oh, I've got bookcases and books, which are very expensive. I can't say because I couldn't find any records of book purchases and such, but definitely bookcases. So I leave it to readers to decide what they think she did that with. But yeah, she liked a wide variety of things. She was into style and makeup and everything. And she enjoyed going to the theater.
Yeah. The theme that kind of goes throughout the entire book is her promiscuity, right? And I think there were some things in there that shocked me even, especially at the beginning when we talk about the first man that she really like fell head over heels for. And
Hmm.
there was a letter in there where she had written him. I'm going to blush even
Yes.
just talking about it, where she talks about how she and another girl would be waiting for him. Um,
Yes.
I, I I don't even know what question to ask when it comes to this, but was that unusual for the time for someone to be so open with her sexuality as she was?
She was very different from many women of her time. She was unashamedly sexual. Um, and she wasn't uh, given to having regrets. And this is something we'd see throughout, even in her last days. She wasn't someone who would look back and regret things. She was a character who wanted things and was willing to do anything to get those things. So it wasn't just material possessions. It wasn't fine apartments, wasn't fine clothing only. It was also that man is attractive. I'd like to have him as a lover. She would invariably get that man as her lover.
Yeah. Let's talk about that man. I don't remember his name off the top of my
Uh,
head.
the first one was Philip Stanhope, second Earl of Chesterfield,
Yes.
and he was a bit of a bad boy.
And that's
Yeah.
what she was probably attracted to as well, huh?
Yeah, well, he was dashing, he was good looking, he was sexually experienced, a few years older than her. Um, and he brought a great excitement into her teenage life. And she was with him for about 3 years. I mean, they weren't living together, but they were certainly in an intimate relationship. And I think that's clear enough from the letters. Uh, and I think she did have a sexual awakening with Philip because he was a bit of a Lothario. He had multiple women at the same time. And I don't know, this must have excited Barbara. She might have had this sort of competitive streak where she wanted to see if she could be the one who ultimately got him. But the problem here is that she and Philip, no matter uh, how closely aligned they were they were pretty much perfect for each other, I think, in terms of their views on life, their political alliances, their sexual appetites. They had so much in common. However, he wanted to marry someone who had money.
Hmm.
And so it didn't matter how beautiful Barbara was or how much fun he had with her and how great everything was together. That didn't matter. He wanted a beauty who was also rich. And and so he didn't marry Barbara. And unfortunately, this meant that Barbara was considered used goods at this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because she didn't have any money. When her father died, there was a great deal of problems with the finances already. And with him gone, um, her mother, who also came from a wealthy family, but with the Civil War and everything, her family had lost their lands and their wealth, so they were quite poor, and so Barbara had a childhood in which she experienced poverty. I mean, not as much as other people, of course. She was still, but she still had this feeling, this intense feeling of being denied things. And I think that that's probably why she became so covetous later on, because it was something in childhood which she felt she was denied having things. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And because of her history with Philip, it made
mm,
it maybe a little bit more difficult for her to find a husband, would you say?
yes, yes. But there were those who would have married her anyway, even though she had no money. Um, she was this incredible character, even at a young age. So she was 18, and one of these gentlemen who did take a genuine interest in her was a young man called Roger Palmer. And he was very different from Philip. He was a conscientious, dutiful, um, sort of cerebral sort of person. So, very, very different to her. Um, and he did fall in love with her genuinely, and I think that's a bit sad for him. Um, and I can't say exactly why she married him, but she did. Even though there were some great protests about it from his family. They could see, especially his father could see that they were not suited for each other. Barbara was too different. She wanted completely different things, for the most part, from Roger. Um, so this is a situation that we are not sure why she accepted him, but she did. And it was probably because of the circumstances. She probably had very few choices at this time because of the nature of her relationship with Philip. Most people around knew about this relationship she had had. Um, but Roger seemed to put this aside and not think about it, and he just wanted to marry her. He loved her, and that was that.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Uh,
but it was not going to be a happily ever after for them,
No,
unfortunately.
no, it wasn't. And she could not get her mind off of Philip, could she?
No,
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 he was like that elusive, I don't even know what word I want to, we'll just say treat. He was like this elusive treat that she just had to have, but
yes,
he would never really give himself to her in the way that she wanted.
no. And shortly after she married Roger, she became so just disillusioned with him because he was totally not what she wanted. And he with her because she had a tendency, even at that age, to be quite angry. So she would have, well, what we'd call tantrums, in effect. She would fly off the handle when she didn't get her way. And she was not happy. And so she resumed her relationship with Philip. So this is the start of her adultery. And so Philip, of course, he didn't mind having relations with this lady because now there was no way he was going to have any trouble should she get pregnant or anything. She was another man's responsibility. Um, and unfortunately, Roger found out and he was quite hurt about this. And he told her if she was going to continue doing that, he was just going to take her away from London to the countryside and to his family home at Dorney Court. Um, and she continued. She didn't care.
Mhm.
Uh, and so he did. He made good on his threat, and he took her to this place. And she would have regarded this as a backwater. It would be in the countryside, nothing fun at all, even though it was rather close to Windsor Castle. But there was nothing there for her to do. Um, if she was a different type of lady who enjoyed the countryside, she would have loved it. But that was not for her. She wanted to be in the center of things because she was someone who needed to be the focal point of everything. Um, so that's what happened.
Yeah, she did like to be the center of attention, that's for sure.
Mhm.
I think maybe we should fast forward a little bit to her introduction to the future King Charles II, because that is how most people know her today, is as the
Yes.
mistress of the king. So, how did she meet him?
Well, I did mention how Roger and Barbara had almost nothing in common, but they had one very important thing in common, and that was they both wanted to see the restoration of the Stuart monarchy.
Mm.
And so, for this cause, or in this cause, they journeyed to the continent, probably Brussels, though there's some speculation it could have been Breda or elsewhere. Um, but I believe it was Brussels. They went there with £1,000, which was a huge sum at that time,
Yeah.
huge. And Barbara was entrusted to give this to the king. And the king was not only penniless at the time, but he was living largely on the charity of others, including his relations, who were often at foreign courts. Um, and so he meets this beguiling, beautiful teenager, and she's come to help him in his in his need. And he's taken with her quite quickly, and she with him. This is someone that her family had always supported. And so here she was with this man who was, in her eyes and in the eyes of all those who supported him, the king. And this was an incredible moment for her to be the one who was giving him money and she was there in his presence, and everything was working out for them because they enjoyed each other's company immensely. They were very, very compatible. So she thought perhaps she was very compatible with Philip, but with Charles, they really hit it off.
Yeah, how amazing. And for somebody who enjoyed attention as much as she did, to get the attention of the perceived King of England. I mean, how could you go wrong when it comes to that, really, right?
Hmm. And she certainly made a mark on him. I mean, he was definitely smitten with her as much as he could be. I mean, this was a man who really appreciated beautiful women. He already had had some mistresses and several illegitimate children by this point. So he could appreciate a fine woman, and here she was.
Yeah. So when Charles finally was able to come to England and take up his throne as king, let's talk about where that left Barbara.
Right. So they initially met in the winter of 1660. And fast forward a few months, he was restored and he came over. Um, and so we're looking about May, late May, that lots of people say that this is the traditional story, that the relationship began when he celebrated his first night in London, entwined in Barbara's arms. Now, that's a very romantic story. That's great. And yeah, they probably were together. But I think that given their natures, the relationship began back in Breda. I mean, no, back in Brussels, excuse me. And so um, they were pretty much together quite often for the foreseeable future from that point.
Well, so then the question remains, how did Barbara's husband feel about this?
Well, it was a very difficult situation for him to find himself in. He was a very devoted monarchist. He was very supportive of the Stuart line. And for him to see that his wife was now getting all this attention from the king, it must have been very hard for him to take. He didn't find it an honorable position. And some people sometimes say that, oh, he enjoyed having this because it elevated him to become Earl uh, of Castlemaine. But no, the thing is, he found it very dishonorable. He was always trying to do the right thing, and for him, this wasn't right. And so he kept a rather low profile, largely, um, and it was a very complicated situation, quite painful, I'd imagine as well.
Yeah, most definitely. Especially if he loved her as much as it seems. It
Hmm.
must have really been conflicting for him to see this woman he loved so much to be having an affair with this monarch who he wished
Yeah.
to have restored to his place.
And it wasn't even very well eh, hidden. It wasn't. It was pretty much rather open public knowledge. And Samuel Pepys, who was a famous writer of the period, he noted that he started saying things about, oh, the king is having a party next door with Mistress Palmer, who he has a fancy to, and so people knew that they were spending a lot of time together, but that it would be so open would come later, and not everyone thought it was fitting for a king to behave in such a manner
Yeah.
with a married woman.
Right, exactly. At what point did the moniker uncrowned queen come into play?
I think she was pretty much present since the beginning of his return into the country. So, um, pretty quickly. I mean, I don't think it was done in any official way. This is what we're calling her, but she was definitely there, and people who wanted to get to the king had to go through her first. She was sort of the gatekeeper in some in a way. And if you pleased her, if she liked you, she would probably grant you access to the king and that sort of thing. Um, but she was someone who enjoyed parties and diversions and all sorts of entertainments. She kept a great table. She was an excellent hostess. And so people who were invited to her parties had a generally great time. Um, so so she had this fun manner with the king, and only with the people that she didn't like could she be a problem, really.
Well, the king obviously needed a bride, and Barbara could
Yes.
not fill that role for him since she was already
Yeah.
married. And of course, the best place to find a bride when you are a monarch is in another country, so you can form alliances and find some money,
Yes.
right? So,
Yes.
so there was a marriage arrangement made with Catherine of Braganza.
Yes, indeed.
Let's talk about that a
Yes.
little bit.
Well, Catherine of Braganza was a little older than Barbara, and she had experienced a very sheltered upbringing. She was very pious and gentle and very different in terms of her personality. Um, and she came over. She was married to Charles II in 1662. So Barbara had enjoyed 2 years of being a sort of uncrowned queen, so to speak. Um, and Barbara was unsure about this new bride. She possibly was afraid, and some speculated at the time that she was apprehensive about her position. She could lose everything if she lost her position with the king. And so when Catherine came, there was some talk that Barbara, who was again heavily pregnant, she had a child in 9 months after his Charles's return to England, and then she was pregnant again here in 1662. And a rumor went around that she was going to have her lying in, and that's in preparation for giving birth to a child. That was a custom at that time. She was going to have her lying in at Hampton Court Palace. And that, of course, was precisely where Charles was going to bring Catherine for their honeymoon. So that sent tongues wagging quite a lot around the courts. The audacity of Barbara to do such a thing. But that was her way. She wouldn't be meek about anything. Um, but she probably was a bit apprehensive about Catherine. But when Catherine arrived and there was talk that there needed to be ladies of the bedchamber, that there was this wonderful position of First Lady of the Bedchamber. That was a highly coveted position because it granted you very close access to the Queen. And there was a list drawn up and of suitable women for this position. And Barbara asked Charles for the position of First Lady of the Bedchamber, even though she was of low rank compared with some of the other women. Uh, of course, Catherine had been told about this woman, this Barbara, this Lady Castlemaine as she was by then. And she knew not to have anything to do with her. However, she saw this paper and saw that Barbara's name was on it, and she adamantly refused. She said, I'm not having that woman at all. It would be disrespectful and disgraceful. And so there was a huge fracas, a major row, lots of arguments between Charles and Barbara, as usual, pushed for her way. And Charles relented. Okay. And so he took her to meet Catherine and introduced her in such a way as to make Catherine unaware of who she really was. And one of Catherine's attendants bent over and whispered in Catherine's ear that this is the king's mistress. And Catherine apparently became so upset. She rapidly had quite a bad nosebleed. It affected her so profoundly that she had this reaction. And Charles actually found more fault with her actions for her behavior there than he did for his own behavior and that of Barbara. So that's what we're looking at here.
Why am I not surprised by this? I keep trying to find similarities between Henry VIII and Charles II. And of course, Henry VIII had mistresses, maybe not as many as Charles II had. However, he tried, I feel like, to keep it a little more under wraps, maybe not making it as public, although he did bring his mistresses into the Queen's household, but the Queen dare not say anything against it, you know? And
yeah, sorry.
And Catherine de Braganza clearly found herself in a difficult situation because what do you do? He's the king, really.
Yeah, but she didn't stay quiet. She fought about it. She fought against this because she knew it wasn't right. Um, and she asked for the Earl of Clarendon, who was a major or a top minister at the time, to fight on her behalf, you know. And he did. He did have words with the king. And Charles replied saying, if you go against me, or if anyone goes against me in this, I will make that person my enemy, pretty much. So he was in this clear example, he was manipulated by Barbara in an area of politics because this was a political situation as well. And so she got her way. Catherine was defeated and she had to accept Barbara as her first lady of the bedchamber.
Mm. It
And
just, I feel so bad for her. And then Catherine, of course, is having a difficult time conceiving while Barbara's getting
yeah,
pregnant left and right.
yes, that must have been intensely painful for her to see this. And not only Barbara, well, that was clearly in her face all the time, Barbara's um, pregnant body, but knowing the previous loves of her husband and the children of those unions, and knowing that he was also sleeping with other people at the same time, all of this would have exacerbated her terrible state. And I think that Catherine was physically affected by emotional stress. Anything that would stress her would cause her some physical complaints. And she she endured things in a sort of very noble way. But if we see it from Barbara's point of view, we see that Barbara thought that she was, in effect, Charles's wife, right? She thought, well, she was, in effect, the queen. She had a really good relationship with her, mother-in-law figure, so to speak, Henrietta Maria. They actually had a good relationship. And we know how difficult that can be sometimes in that position of mother-in-laws. Oh dear, but they got on. They got on really well, especially when perhaps Barbara converted to Roman Catholicism. And that probably made Henrietta Maria even happier. She was already happy with Barbara. Um, and she got on with her real daughter-in-law, but she did have fondness for Barbara as the mother of her grandchildren too. So there was definitely that. Um, but it was a very interesting situation, sad on multiple levels, but certainly very intriguing and fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I definitely was intrigued when I read that she had a good relationship with Henrietta Maria. I thought, how strange that she was accepted so well. And then when I read that she converted to Catholicism, I thought, well, this seems odd for such a promiscuous woman who seemed to not really care about what people thought about her. And she didn't necessarily change her ways after converting as well either, did she?
No, that had no effect upon her really. Um, I think that it was sort of trendy in this small group of people to convert to Catholicism. I mean, we see it with the likes of the Duke and Duchess of York, who were close friends of Barbara's at the time. Um, so there is that. And Barbara, if anything, she was always fashionable. So whatever was the fashion, she would be in it. There was a fashion for wearing men's clothes at one point, with the periwig and the flamboyant, the cravat with, the lace and the sort of the the early kind of three-piece suit that men wore at the time. And there are these portraits of these uh, popular women at court. Uh, and Barbara was among them, and they would wear this, and that was part of the trend. And of course, she was in that. There was a trend for the sort of, imagined Orientalist movement, sort of this aesthetic. And there's one, and I have this in my book, this portrait of her, and she's wearing a sort of turban-like hat and this different sort of costume. And this was all part of her showing off this taste for the flamboyant, for the ostentatious, trying to get that attention, to be the center of attention. And so we have that. And there are some things as well. She had this, perhaps it's cruel, I think, in some ways. There was a portrait made of Queen Catherine, and it was quite lovely. It was by, I think, Huysmans, if I remember correctly. And she was dressed as a shepherdess, and it was sort of, there were reds and a big wide hat and a shepherdess crook and everything. And that was great. But then shortly thereafter, Barbara herself had a painting commissioned showing herself as the same kind of shepherdess. And it's very cruel because she did pull it off better. And it's so sad. I don't know, what's the equivalent now? I don't know, girls doing photos on Instagram, or is it TikTok and trying to do similar poses?
Yeah.
And if Barbara was living in this time, she would be all over social media with all the selfies.
Yes, she definitely would. I do love, she definitely, to me, feels like she was the life of the party. She would be the one who was the best dressed and would be out on the dance floor having
Oh,
the
yes.
best time. And if Charles maybe wasn't paying attention to her, she would look at other men as well.
Yes,
And
definitely.
I think that's interesting. I want to talk about that
Yeah.
too, because that was something that I
Okay.
didn't expect. As the mistress of a king, I didn't expect her to also stray.
No. And so she's very different from some of her contemporaries, other love rivals, if you will. We know that Nell Gwyn was a very famous Restoration actress, and she was a later lover or mistress of Charles II's. And she was known for not straying after she became a royal mistress of his. And the same could not be said for Barbara, who uh, was not particularly given to fidelity. And she was as promiscuous as some of the male courtiers around her. So the Restoration court was hedonistic, quite sensual, and there were many sort of predatory men at court. And Barbara was sort of the equivalent of this for a woman. When she saw a man she wanted, she invariably got him. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm intrigued by the fact that she had so many children and that Charles acknowledged them even though she was married. Why do you think he did that?
I think it's because they, I think everyone knew that she had been spending a fair bit more time with him than with her own husband. The first child, the eldest, was Anne, and she, her parentage is, her paternity is a bit debatable, really. Um, it's really unsure. Um, she might have been Charles's. I mean, the timings fit in perfectly with having been conceived the week that he returned to England. Well, she was born in 1661, so a year after the Restoration. So 9 months after he was restored. But her paternity is rather undetermined because although she was acknowledged by Charles II, the child could have been sired by Roger Palmer, who was Barbara's husband, or Philip, her first love, because there is some reason to believe that she might have picked up with him a little bit around the Restoration, because everyone was at this time, these royalists were quite happy with everything. Everything was going their way, and there was this feeling of euphoria around. And so it seemed like all the troubles that they had known over the past decade or so had gone away. And I mean, it is conceivable that Anne might have been his. And some people later on said how similar she looked to Philip. So we don't know, but it's possible. But anyway, Charles did acknowledge Anne. So,
Yeah.
but they went on to have probably, because all the rest of the children looked very similar in the subsequent ones. Charles, who was born in 1662. We had Henry, who was born the following year. We had Charlotte the year after that. George the year after that. So she was having children every year. Um, and yet she was still considered a great beauty. So, and the thing is, there was high infant mortality and maternal mortality at this time. So for her to have consistently had children that survived, and for her to have survived the trauma of childbirth, is incredible. So she was a very hardy person. She had a great, healthy constitution. That's it.
Yeah, she definitely did. And, and most of her kids were named Fitzroy, as we know. That would mean a
Yes.
child of the king. And
Mhm.
what kind of mother would you say Barbara was? I mean, I think from what we've learned today, we can make an assumption about what kind of mother she was, but I would like to hear what you think.
Yeah, well, it's difficult because we have ideas about what a good mother is now, nurturing and kind and sweet and warm and all those things. Barbara wasn't really known for having those qualities. I mean, she was great at making the children and they were fine, but they were largely brought up at court, which was not a very wholesome place for children. Um, and also, there are some stories of her being a little cruel to them. Um, and yet, she always tried to make sure that they were materially comfortable. So we could say that the priorities were different then, and all of her children, for the most part, were given dukedoms, had advantageous marriages. She was really keen on having her children betrothed to politically advantageous other families. And so that was her main objective. Her objective was to make sure that her children were secured.
Yeah, and that's really during that time period. That was being a good
Mhm.
mother too.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's
yes.
let's fast forward a little bit here
Sure.
to the final years with Charles because she outlived him.
hmm
And let's just talk about maybe like the final year before he died. What was their relationship like at that time?
Well, lots of people think that the relationship between Charles and Barbara ended in 1670 when he made her the Duchess of Cleveland. There's this idea that he just severed ties with her. But here, you're a duchess now, goodbye. No, it wasn't like that. They still had their children, and he was very much involved in their children's lives. And he he was concerned about Barbara. Um, I was doing some research at the archives in Chatsworth, which is very close to where I live here in Derbyshire, England. And I was looking through these papers, and I found Charles having written about Barbara that he was concerned about her being taken advantage of by a young French nobleman, Alexis de Chatillon, um, with whom she was having an affair. She was she had moved to France in the 1670s, and she was very much involved in the court of Louis XIV. She was on friendly terms with the king there, who was, of course, Charles's cousin,
Mm.
right? So there are all lots of connections with the royal families. And Charles wrote that he was concerned that this young Marquis was maybe abusing his position to get money from Barbara, and he was concerned about that. Um, and he did go on to say in one of these letters to her that he still had feelings for her and he'd always cherish her, and he had affection for her after all these years, for all the happiness that they had shared together. And so perhaps it wasn't the passionate romance that they had enjoyed in the 1660s, but it was a sort of mature, old kind of love. He still loved her in a way. So I thought that was quite moving, some of the things that he said to her. And she replied to him saying that, well, as to love, one is not mistress of oneself. You have to just forgive all that
Mm.
because we just have to follow our hearts in a manner of speaking. So, yeah, they did have a very interesting life and relationship. But in the weeks before his death, he died in early 1685 in the winter. Um, she had returned to England, and she was in his company a few days before he died. And John Evelyn remarked about this. He was another courtier and diarist from the period, and he saw this scene of several of the royal mistresses sitting together with the king, and there were singers, and there was this great entertainment, and they were eating and enjoying each other's company, like old friends. So they had become friends, or they were always friends, but they still maintained that sort of amicable relationship of friendship. And just a few days later, Charles II died.
Mm. And so after his death, how did her life change?
Well, we would think that it just became quiet and everything, but that's not what happened. She went on to have quite a lot of social drama. Again, she had numerous liaisons with men, um, with actors. She had an actor live in her house for some time, and potentially father another child. She had a daughter, probably with John Churchill, who became the first Earl of Marlborough. So there are all these connections. Um, but by the 1690s, after William and Mary had ascended the thrones as a consequence of the so-called Glorious Revolution.
Mm.
Um, so we're looking 1688, 89. Then they became the rulers, but they brought in a type of moral change that made the moral pendulum swing from what was possible in the 1660s with Charles II to a very other kind of situation. Um, it was highly moralistic. Any kind of adultery was looked down upon in the royal circles. And it is something that is quite different. And Barbara had the daughter, little Barbara, with John Churchill, and this little girl grew up, and she had the misfortune of falling in love and having a child out of wedlock during this period,
Mm.
the 1690s. And this is something she probably thought was fine because her own mother had done the same. But it was very different because society changes. It goes, I think it's like a pendulum. It goes one way and then the other. And so she was punished for this, and she went to a nunnery in France, and that was that. It was quite a sad ending for her, and she stayed in the nunnery for the rest of her life, which was quite long.
It must have been difficult for her mother to see her go through that.
Mm. But and yet Barbara did not make anything, did not leave anything to little Barbara in her will. So I don't know what her thoughts were about that. Um, Maybe she had had a change of heart about that sort of thing, and perhaps that's why she left her out of her will. I don't know. Some things we just don't know, and there are so many questions. If Barbara was alive, I would have loved to sit down and, after she saw all the social media stuff and everything, and have a cup of tea and say, well, tell me about this. What were your thoughts about this and that? It would have been wonderful. Um, so what we're left with are holes in these stories, and we can just think about what people's motivations were and why they
Yeah.
did what they did. Yeah.
What an interesting woman in history to learn about. I'm
Mm.
so grateful I got to read your book and learn more about Barbara Villiers. I do want to know, Andrea, what
Yes,
is
thank you.
one thing that you would like people to know about Barbara? What would be your takeaway for people?
Well, I think that the most important thing about Barbara is the amazing period of time in which she lived. And so many people overlook this. They ignore it. Um, And it's fascinating. She lived from 1640 to 1709. And in that time, no end of change had occurred. There was, this burgeoning scientific community. There was art and music and literature. And it was an incredible time. Politically, socially, all sorts of things happened. And to see the life of this woman who had an enormous amount of influence and power and saw so much. I mean, she lived through civil war, plague, the Great Fire of London. She saw different changes, different reigns, and she met people who were really interesting and influential. And there's so much, there's just so much about her. She's endlessly fascinating. Even if we sometimes don't like her, she is still fascinating. And the time in which she lived is just incredible.
Yeah, it really is. A lot of people are drawn to the Tudor period because of all the
Mhm.
drama and intrigue.
Yeah.
But the Stuarts really knew how to to make some
Yes.
drama.
Yes. Well, if if people are interested in, royal sex scandals and intrigues and political uh, events, I'd say come on over to the Stuart side just for a bit. Have a taste of what we can offer and then make up your mind.
Yes, I agree. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show today, because I am intrigued by the Stuart period. And I think it's just as interesting as the Tudors,
Yeah.
or even as interesting as the medieval period. And
Hmm.
I absolutely loved the anecdotes that you had in your book. I
Thank
always
you.
find that the most interesting, all of the little clips of Samuel Pepys, what he had to say of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're looking
He-
for a great book to learn about the Stuart period, I highly recommend you check out Andrea's new book. Andrea, why don't you let people know where they can purchase it and where they can find you on social media?
Well, thank you so much. Um, I am on lots of different social media accounts, so you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, Threads, X, um, YouTube. I have my once monthly online live streamed show called Stuart Saturday Live. So I have a guest every month, and we have a chat about various things. Sometimes it's about a specific topic. Like last month was with historian Adrian Tinniswood, and we talked about the Great Fire of London. Um, Last Saturday, I had Margaret Porter on my show, and we talked about her books that are set in the 17th century and Rose's Stuart history in general. So there's a lot for people who are interested in history, and you might find it of interest to you. But every Saturday on X, we also do Stuart Saturday, and I set a theme or a topic, and anyone can contribute, and I retweet it, and it's such a thriving community, and it's fun, and the more the merrier, really. But it's at 17THCENTURYLADY, so 17th Century Lady. I'm also on, you can find me online. I have podcasts as well. So you can go to my website, www.andreazuvich.com. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes. And I'll have all links to everything for that in the show notes as well. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.
And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. As a patron, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, some patron-exclusive content, and even discounts on upcoming webinars and lectures. Head on over to Patreon today to find out more information. And for as little as $3 a month, you can show your support. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.